All right, 3, 2, 1. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. His name is David Livingstone, or Stone. He has published many books, but he's just recently put out a work that's very impressive, encyclopedic in its knowledge, and definitely parapolitical, a lot of occult material in there. The title of the book, which you can find online, is Ordo Ab Chao. And if you can see on YouTube, you can see it's all spelled out. So it's Ordo Ab Chao.ca, I believe. So if you'd like to check that out, I've been reading through it today. I didn't have time to go through the whole material. There's tons of stuff, 6 total, really almost books in themselves. But he's also written other books: The Dying God, The Hidden History of Western Civilization, published in 2002, Black Terror, White Soldiers, Islam, Fascism, and the New Age, published June 2013. Transhumanism, very timely topic. Transhumanism, The History of a Dangerous Idea, 2015. And Terrorism and the Illuminati, A 3,000-Year History. And I've read through that book. That was published in 2017. So, Mr. Livingstone, are you there?
I'm here.
It's Stone or Stone? Livingstone, right?
I think it's Stone, yeah.
Okay. For people who haven't heard your name or may not be familiar with work, can you talk a little bit about your background and what led you to this work that you've published online, Ordo Ab Chao?
Yeah, it's now 30 years of study. So this is why my recent book is really is very much the result of all that effort. So I've even shocked myself at the amount of new ideas and concepts that I was able to discover. Even though I've been at it for so long, I thought I'd touch a lot of topics, but this is so many of them are brand new and so pivotal, like so crucial to understanding the bigger picture. Basically, what I've been trying to do the last 30 years is understand the history of the occult. And of course, that's not just for its own sake. It's because those who spearhead this tradition have attained, especially in the last couple of centuries, positions of very important influence where they've basically been able to orchestrate most of the recent events. So to understand what they've done, why they've done it, and ideally, if we can try to understand what they're trying to do, then the only way to do that is to explore the history of the cult. It's not an easy task because it's not available in mainstream history books. Right. It is touched on by a number of occult books, but those books are grossly unreliable because they tend to have to do mostly with legends. The thing is that with every legend, there's a piece of truth to it. So it's been a matter of trying to sift through all these occult legends and try to get to the root of what the true history was, because it is at least it's a very ancient history. It's at least a 3,000-year history, and one that is, particularly for what we know as Western history, is basically a whitewashed version of occult history for the masses.
Right. It's fascinating. Yeah. So you actually start this new book all the way back to Chaldean Magi, ancient Greece. So you're definitely starting right from the time of recorded history.
Yes.
Which is what the right. Sorry, please go.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that's what the Masons do. OTO. Right. You have a section on Crowley, an excellent section on Crowley.
Albert
Pike. So they're looking at it in this kind of great swath of history. So I think it's important for you to uncover all that stuff and show what these guys are thinking, of the people who orchestrated 9/11, things like that. Stuff that's going on with COVID, Great Reset, Schwab. Yeah. So where would you like to cover? We talked a little bit in the pre-interview, but do you have anything that from the book that might be timely?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about what I just posted today, because it really ties in to some of the most important, if not the most important, finding in my recent book. So basically, what's happening on the 21st of December is what's called the Great Conjunction. And that's basically when the planets of Jupiter and Saturn line up and basically are on top of each other. So this is an event that happens every 20 years. It's the most important event in occult astrology. So what's interesting is that, so first of all, astrologers, I mean, it's being published in the mainstream news, but I don't think a lot of people are catching on to the significance of it. But astrologers are referring to it as the Christmas star. So what's particularly interesting about this particular conjunction is that it lines up exactly with the winter solstice. So of course, there's 4 Luciferian holidays a year, and that lines up with the 2 solstices and 2 equinoxes. And so those are Christmas, Easter, St. John's Day, and Halloween. So I read an article today that pointed out that although this happens every 20 years, the closeness of this particular alignment hasn't happened since 1623. So this is pretty shocking, because one of the most important findings that I've done that I share in my latest book is because I've studied the Rosicrucians for a while. The Rosicrucians are essential to this entire story, right? I mean, basically, you got several stages in the development of occult tradition, and for at least Western history, it starts with the Templars, and then basically reemerges as the Rosicrucians. The Rosicrucians result in the Freemasons, and finally the Illuminati. So the advent of the Rosicrucians in particular really represents the modern birth of the most influential cult tradition. So if you look at their own literature, what happens is that the advent of the Rosicrucians was deliberately timed with the great conjunction of their time, which was supposed to happen in 1623. So the Rosicrucian movement actually emerged a few years before that, when the first manifestos were published. But it's when the movement was announced to the world that it happened in 1623. So also what I show in my book, this is all part of my latest findings. In fact, this is what I've treated before, but I've gone into more depth this time. So what's unique is that I've seen no other scholars identify is that right after this period, so first of all, the Rosicrucians, they supposedly get defeated because what happens is so the Rosicrucian movement is based on the marriage of Frederick V of the Palatinate to Elizabeth Stuart, who's the daughter of King James. So this is written about in a book by Valentin Andrea called The Chemical Wedding, which means the alchemical wedding. So this wedding was particular significance, and I explain where that goes in a minute before I explain becomes before.
Okay.
So basically, the Rosicrucian movement is defeated, but it survives in a group called the Hartlib Circle. They call it Hartlib Circle because it's a circle around a person, at least three people in particular. But the leader of it is a guy named Samuel Hartlib, and then his three partners who are John Dury and John Comenius. So they form what's called the Invisible College, and that's well known that the Royal Society derived out of the Invisible College, and then the Freemasonry came out of the Royal Society. So the Hartlib Circle basically were Rosicrucians, and they were intimately involved with Manasseh ben Israel. So Manasseh ben Israel is a very important rabbi of Amsterdam. Amsterdam at the time was basically, the center of European Jews, because before that they had been kicked out of Spain, and one of the places where they found refuge was in Amsterdam, because they were largely able to follow their own religion. They didn't have to remain conversos as they did. Thanks for that chapter, because that's the fiery trigon right there.
That's it. Okay.
So Manasseh ben Israel, this is basically what it was found, is that he paid Oliver Cromwell to overthrow Charles I, who happens to be the brother of Elizabeth Stuart, who married Frederick V. They were the children of King James. So the result of that is that in exchange, Cromwell repealed the law, or helped to repeal the law that barred Jews from entering England, because the Jews had been expelled from England since the year 1290. So Manasseh ben Israel becomes the leader of this circle of all these Rosicrucians, and they begin to start fanning expectations about the significance of the year 1666, which they believe, based on their interpretations of the Book of Revelation, will represent the advent of the Messiah. So, of course, what happens is that in that year, that's the year that Shabtai Zevi declares himself Messiah. And his immediate influence happens all around these people who are these millenarians associated with the Hartlib Circle, particularly a guy named Peter Serrarius. And Peter Serrarius is Manasseh ben Israel's main partner, and he's the one who keeps most of these guys abreast of the events of Shabtai Zevi's mission, and particularly people like John Dury, and most important, a guy named, what was his first name? Oldenburg, this is his last name, who is one of the founders of the Royal Society. So when you look at the Royal Society, it's basically mostly composed of people who are associated with the Hartlib Circle, so-called Invisible College, and associated directly and indirectly with Manasseh ben Israel. So what I found, this is my most recent findings, is that Manasseh ben Israel's followers, the first thing they do in London is they create the Bevis Marks Synagogue, and I talk about this in my chapter on the Freemasons. So Bevis Marks Synagogue then has 4 sister congregations in the United States, and I talk about that in my chapter on the American Revolution. So the 4 synagogues are Sheerith Israel in London, the Touro Synagogue in Newport, the Mikveh Israel Synagogue in Philadelphia. The reason why it's called Mikveh Israel is because Manasseh ben Israel wrote a book about the lost tribes supposedly living in North America, which he called The Last Hope? The Last Hope, which translates as Mikveh Israel. I hope I got that title correctly, please. Whoever's looking that up, you'll have to verify that. But the Hebrew title is Mikveh Israel. So these are the congregations that are involved basically in fomenting the American Revolution, particularly a guy named Haim Solomon, who was a Rothschild agent. And it's this network of Masons associated with these 4 synagogues, particularly Beth Elohim in Charleston, who found Scottish Rite Freemasonry in, I believe, the year 1801. So to backtrack a bit, this entire network is based on the descendants of the alchemical wedding of Frederick V and Elizabeth Stuart. So all their descendants become the key actors in the development of Freemasonry, tied, of course, with the Invisible College. So primarily, because what happens is that I think it's Charles II who's succeeded by James II. And James II is overthrown by William of Orange. But William of Orange happens also to be a descendant of the alchemical wedding. But nevertheless, James is a Stuart family. So what happens is you get the Jacobite movement that are committed to the restoration of the Stuart dynasty. And the Jacobite movement then basically are at war with the Brits, who because of their rejection of James II, and they flee to France. So it's there in France that they begin the founding of what's called Écossais Freemasonry, or Scottish Masonry. So this all develops in France. So the main people who are associated with are all descendants of the chemical wedding. So principally, you have Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, the various dukes of Orleans, starting with Philip II. Philip II of Orleans. This is very interesting because he married the daughter. Is it the daughter of a woman who is involved in a notorious affair? She was accused of practicing black magic rituals involving human sacrifice, called the Affair of the Poisons. So basically, it's a family. The Orleans family, in particular, were notoriously involved in the black arts.
Yes,
And yeah, and his descendant, I think his great grandson, was Philip Duke of Orleans, known as the Duke of Chartres sometimes, or Philippe Égalité, which is the name that he took on in the French Revolution, Illuminati, and one of the leaders of the French Revolution. And the other one, the other important person is Charles of Hessen-Kassel. So he is part of the Hessen-Kassel family. It's with his father that the Rothschild family begins their fortune. And so Charles of Hessen-Kassel becomes not only a member of the Illuminati and basically organizes the first of several Masonic conferences, particularly one Wilhelmsbad in 1682. But he's also becomes Grand Master of the Asiatic Brethren. The Asiatic Brethren are very important because they were founded by Moses Dobruschka, who is the cousin of Jacob Frank. So out of the successors, Rabbi Antelman discovered a list, what he called a list of ordination, which lists the various successors, recognized successors, Shabtai Zvi. So among them is Rabbi Allion, who is a rabbi associated with Bevis Marx, so closely associated, and that's the synagogue that was involved in the birth of Freemasonry. Also Rabbi Eberschutz, who is very important because Rabbi Eberschutz, he was part of what's called the Emden-Eberschutz controversy, which is really what brought the Sabbatean movement to the fore. It's important to remember that in Judaism, Sabbateanism was a heresy, regarded as a heresy. The legitimate traditional rabbis attempted to suppress the movement. So they excommunicated Sabbateans, but they weren't able to suppress it. It basically continued to survive underground, principally through organizations like the Freemasons and the Illuminati. So Jacob Frank is another successor, and again, his cousin is Moses Dobruschka, who founds the Asiatic Brethren. One of the most important. So another person who's listed on the list of ordination as the final, successor at that time was Moses Mendelssohn. So Moses Mendelssohn becomes the leader of what's called Haskalah, and that's a Jewish enlightenment. And it's a movement basically that attempts to reform Judaism. So effectively, it was the source of creating what eventually became referred to as Reform Judaism. And so all these guys, the guys who were in this Haskalah, were all associated with the Asiatic Brethren. They were also associated with what's called the Juden Lodge, because the Asiatic Brethren were particularly a guy named Molitor, who was the Grand Master of the Juden Lodge in Frankfurt, also called the Rising Dawn, which was founded by a Rothschild agent. This is all history you can find in the most reputable books, like who's the writer of the History of the Jews? I can't remember his name. History of Jews and Freemasonry. You can start with him. Antelman's book is also excellent as a start. So then, as this Haskalah movement emerges in the United States, it becomes centered at Beth Elohim Synagogue in Charleston, which of course was also responsible for the formation of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And this is where you get, most importantly, a guy named Rabbi Wise, who is considered the founder of the Hamburg Temple. So the Hamburg Temple is where it begins. So the Hamburg Temple is the source of the Reform movement, which then gets transplanted to the United States. So Rabbi Wise becomes the leader of the movement in the United States, and that's basically where you get the Zionist movement, particularly the Zionist movement in the United States. So, the scholars have tried to trace the survival of the Sabbateans. Most scholars tend to think that they sort of disappeared at the end of the 1900s. There's only a handful of people who are confirmed Sabbateans, and they're all basically the leaders of the American Zionist movement. So that's
wow. So you can trace that all the way back.
Yes. So that's Judge Brandeis, Felix Frankfurter, the Warburgs, and Rabbi Stephen Wise. So these are the guys now who are all basically responsible for leading the Zionist movement in the United States. Which can be all traced back to the Great Conjunction of 1663, which is being predicted to happen in a couple of weeks.
Right, December.
And that's just a piece of the history. There's a lot that goes before it and after it and in between.
Well, I think your writing in this book really shows how much influence a lot of these rabbis and people of the Jewish faith had upon European culture and civilization. How they're crossed.
Let's be clear, though, they're not of the Jewish faith, right? They're Jewish heretics.
Jewish heretics. But there's still people are referencing the rabbis and stuff, etc. At least from what I gleaned from your writing. But I mean it's incredible. So here is Isaac Wise. He says from your book, Masonry is a Jewish institution whose history, degrees, charges, passwords, and explanations are Jewish from beginning to the end. It's pretty fascinating.
Point. Period.
Where do you want to go from there? I mean, what else would you like to cover?
There's so many angles from there because it depends on when you want to cover. There's a whole history that leads up before that. What's really new in my book is about the history of the Order of Santiago, which I had never heard of until the last few years, which is really the survival of the Templars of Spain.
Order of Santiago.
Yeah, and that's really where you get, because that's where the Templars survive, and so Spain is kind of the forgotten chapter of occult history, because after the Templars were disbanded in 1312, something like that, it's in Spain that they survive for a couple of hundred years and they dominate. There's several centuries there that are known as the Golden Age of Judaism under the Islamic Empire. But then it happens with the Reconquista. So for the most part, the Muslims are driven out of Spain, and the Order of Santiago are important in that. But the entire history of the cult through that period, from the end of the Templars to the expulsion from Spain, it resides in Spain and is carried out through the Order of Santiago. Particularly important is what's called the Camino of Santiago, the Way of St. James, which is the pilgrimage route.
Mm-hmm.
And I go into I explain there the source of the significance of St. James and that pilgrimage route, and it's particularly its association with the Abbey of Cluny. So, because what's important is that all these families, the aristocratic families that are associated with the Order of Santiago, are basically crypto-Templars and tend to believe morranos and crypto-Jews. And what happened...
They're still around to this day, is that correct?
Yes, they are. So what happens is that Ferdinand and Isabella were descendants of Jews, despite the fact that they ordered their expulsion in 1492. So what's important is that the day after the Jews were expelled, that's when Columbus gets sent on his voyage to the New World. Because part of the significance, I think, is because according to Kabbalistic prophecy, the Messiah can't come until the Jews are spread across the world. And that's part of the basis of Manasseh ben Israel's mission. That's written about in his book, Hope of Israel. So one of the main funders of Columbus's voyage is Isaac Barbagallo. So there's a few people who are important in the history, modern history of Messianism, Jewish Messianism, and I'd say two of them would be Isaac Abarbanel and then Manasseh ben Israel, whose wife was descended from Isaac Abarbanel. Isaac Abarbanel was also responsible for disseminating what's called the Curse of Ham myth. And the Curse of Ham myth is this idea that the Black Africans are descended from the Canaanites, and therefore their enslavement is sanctioned by the Bible. And that's why you find that the slavery begins with the Knights of Christ, which is also the Neo-Templar order closely associated with the Order of Santiago. It's Prince Henry the Navigator basically gives birth to the slave trade. And so this slave trade basically provides the financial backing for this conspiracy to begin. And it's with this exploration and then the travels to various parts of the Africa and the New World that like Manasseh ben Israel was involved in the slave trade and most of his associates. So that's why the people who came to found Masonry in the United States and the earliest Jewish communities were also associated with this circle of slave trade.
Slave trade, right. That was really a thing. Like the sons of Noah, that was really people broke down the races into those different parts, right? Because one became the Europeans, one became the blacks, one became Asians or Asian, whatever.
That's right.
So.
Japheth
that was the justification. Pardon me?
Japheth is the three sons.
Right.
Japheth. So Japheth is the European. Shem is the ancestor of the Semites, and the sons of Ham, like Cush and I can't remember the other names, are permanently colonized Africa and became the. So the anachronism there is basically that Canaan settled in Canaanite. So he wasn't an African, but for some reason they attributed the curse back to Ham and then attributed it to the African.
Very convenient, right? Convenient biblical basis supposed for
that's right.
Atrocities, right? Yeah. So I mean, you just see these lines of families and things just bubbling from the past to the present. Yes. Especially like through the Hispanic world. Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting too.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like, you know, there's Jews spread around the world. If you look at some of these modern DNA tests, a lot of the Hispanics are like 2 or 3% Sephardic Jews. Yeah, something
exactly. Like that. Yeah, and they're finding the same in South America, in particular places like New Mexico.
Oh, fascinating.
Which is another point I covered too, because New Mexico happens to be, of course, you know, the hub of places. It's the hub of UFO activity.
Interesting.
AKA occult activity. So, you know, places like the Dulce underground base, the Baca, you know, Maurice Strong's Baca Ranch.
Right, Maurice Strong, right? Wasn't he like a New World Order Rockefeller guy?
Yes, he's basically, you know, environmental movement, leader of environmental movement and Rockefeller agent.
Yeah. And you do kind of get up later into the book. You do talk about some of this UFO, fake news, mimetic warfare, modern kind of issues.
Yes.
So I mean, it's you definitely very ambitious. I think you achieved it, and I love the layout of the book. By the way, it's very easy to read, and I appreciate all the.
That's great. Thank
you. Yeah. So very well done job. Great job.
Thank you.
Where else would you like to cover?
Let's cover on the most important finding that I got to for this century.
Okay.
So basically, you know, I've touched on synergism before. Synergism. So, you know, the Illuminati is really only one of several organizations, and I find it. I'm still trying to figure out what's going on, of why they were exposed, and it might be deliberate. You know, one of the reasons why is because they were actually at war with a group called the Golden Rosicrucians, and you know, most of the Golden Rosicrucians evolved into the Asiatic Brethren. So it's kind of, you know, you get these various tracks, particularly the French Illuminati, the Martinists, the Golden Rosicrucians, and the Asiatic Brethren is where the occult tradition survived. So, you know, you got to wonder why I wonder if it was a deliberate strategy to try to, disband and expose the Illuminati to give the impression that they had been shut down.
Right.
So the Martinism basically evolves into synarchism, and it starts with a guy named Alexander Saint Yves d'Albret. And I trace. It's really important at this point because these families converge on the Romanov dynasty through their intermarriage with the children of Queen Victoria, and of course Queen. So, I talked about the chemical wedding before. So that chemical wedding basically converges on George I, and then all modern. The modern British royal family are all traced back to him, and it's basically a very tightly knit tree that involves also one of their ancestors. In fact, there's Christian the Ninth of Denmark, who's considered the grandfather of Europe, and he is a grandson of Charles of Hessen-Kassel, who was the Grand Master of the Asiatic Brethren, and his wife Louise of Hessen-Kassel was friends with the wife of Saint Yves d'Albret, the founder of synarchism.
What were the principles of synarchism?
Right. So we have to remember that the occult has been since the beginning on contact with the, however we want to call it, the spirit world, right? So communicating with the spirit world. There's various ways you can do that. There's channeling, you induce possession, typically they will carry out rituals to induce possession. This is basically what satanic ritual abuse is about, is that you can force a child to face so much horror that they can't handle, that it creates a door that allows demonic entities to enter and possess the child, and then that entity can then communicate to the initiates. So that's why everything is always based on revelations, and that's why the book of Revelation is a blueprint, because it's considered communication from the other world. And this is a tradition that goes back long before the book of Revelation. You find there's a tradition of what's called apocalyptic literature, which was associated particularly with groups like the Essenes, which is all founded on, communications to particular quote unquote prophets who received these revelations from the other world. This happened throughout the centuries, particularly in the Kabbalah. Mystics were said to have had contact with Elijah. Elijah is the most often recurring person. This has its equivalent in Islam as the little kidder, the green one, or Saint George in the Christians. So in the Middle Ages, you have some other important revelations, particularly that of Nostradamus, and it continues. The most recent one, which is very important, I don't think we're going to have time to discuss it, which is the revelations of Fatima, the secrets of Fatima. Those are essential.
Why do you think Fatima secrets are essential?
Because, so what I trace in my book on, what chapter is it? It might be
5 or 6.
It might be the Brotherhood Polaire. So basically, I found a website by a blogger who calls himself Jewish Christian, and he traces the genealogy of the Frankists. And what's amazing is he traces the genealogy of a number of popes, particularly those two in the picture right there. So these are Frankist popes, because when Jacob Frank was arrested and he was held in the monastery, I'm not sure, I'm probably not going to pronounce it properly, but Częstochowa in Poland. And that's the monastery church, I'm not sure what you call it, but basically that's where the Black Madonna is held, the famous Black Madonna. So the Black Madonna, esoterically, is Lilith. And Lilith, according to Zohar, is the Shekinah. So, which is identified with the Messiah. So the Frank was basically responsible for incepting the worship of Mary as a replacement for the Shekinah in crypto-Frankist Christians. So this is why you find these Frankist popes were then responsible for the proliferation of the worship of Mary. And that happens all the way until Pope John Paul II, who was the one who did the most to advance the veneration of Mary, basically beatified more saints than any previous pope combined, and was devoted to what's called the consecration of Russia, which is the most important portion of the third secret of Fatima. So, yeah, so that's a separate tangent.
So your take on it, that these were like actual, real spiritual events, or
no, they're satanic occult events that are disguised as Christian and have been so merged into Catholic Christianity. Because you have to remember that, going back to the Alta Vendita, the plan of the Carbonari, particularly Mazzini, was to take over the Catholic Church. So this is why you find at the beginning of that infiltration starts with Cardinal Rampolla. And the OTO claims Cardinal Rampolla as one of their members.
I've heard that. Yeah, no, I read that somewhere. Right. Definitely. That's
so
true.
What's interesting is that Vatican II, and this is where I quote Kumaraswamy, Ananda Kumaraswamy, who was the son of a follower of René Guénon, who was a friend of Malcolm Martin, who was a Mossad agent, a Jewish agent, who helped to orchestrate Vatican II. They basically were celebrating that Vatican II was the final success of the conspiracy that had begun with the attempt to install Cardinal Rampolla.
Wow, fascinating. That's incredible. That's a whole other show in itself. The infiltration of the Catholic Church. Holy smokes.
Exactly. Masonic infiltration.
Right, Masonic infiltration, P2, all those.
Which is why they called it the new Mass, they call it Novus Ordo Missae.
Wow. That's
right in our faces.
Right in your face. Wow. Yeah, but I mean,
so Synergism is basically devoted to fulfilling the secrets of Fatima and the prophecies of Nostradamus, because they regard those prophecies as communication or commands from the other world. Because the basis of Synergism is that you have to have a stratified society, basically just like Plato's society, where you have the priest class are the rulers, and the priest class are rulers because they're in communication with the gods, quote unquote gods, who basically convey to them, how to govern. Those gods, of course, are the fallen angels, right? The fallen angels, Lucifer and fallen angels. So that's how they operate. So that's what Synergism is. That's how that Synergism is basically refers to the system of government that is employed in Agartha, which is supposed to be in the hollow earth, which is governed by a priest class in communication with the gods.
Fascinating. Yeah, so there's the great game.
So what's interesting is that out of this network are closely affiliated with Nicholas II, and particularly a guy named Papu, who was the mentor to René Guénon, a disciple of Dalvedre, and there's claims that he was responsible for writing the Protocols of Zion. And whether or not that's true, the person who gave the first copy of the Protocols to Sergei Nilus was a woman named Juliana Glinka, who was a disciple of H.P. Blavatsky. So what you find is that the substance of the Protocols came from the rite of Memphis Mizraim. And Memphis Mizraim was founded by Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was the head of the Carbonari with Mazzini.
Right.
Carbonari is basically modern Illuminati. So,
I heard that the protocols came out of Russian intel, turn of the century. Yes. Russian.
Yeah, because they came from the Okhrana office in Paris, and that's where Juliana Glinka was linked to. The thing is, I was just thinking about this today, is that to understand the protocols, I think that George Orwell revealed the significance. So, in 1984, Winston, who's the protagonist, he starts to suspect that things are not what they seem. And I guess somebody picks up on it. The guy, what's his name, is O'Brien or something like that, who befriends him and then shares with him the book, which finally reveals to Winston everything he had suspected was probably going on. That there was a conspiracy to keep people in the dark. But what happens is that instead, that book was a trap, and it was used to catch him, ensnare him, and then eventually, ultimately neutralize him. And that's, I think, is the secret to understanding the exposure of the protocol. So, like in the end, I think even O'Brien asked the question, like, does what's his name? Not Silverstein, but the Goldstein is the leader of the supposed resistance, right? Does he exist or doesn't he exist? He said that question will always trouble you. And you'll never know the answer. And as the protocols, are they true or are they not true?
Right.
Right. So
it's a much more liminal book. It's much more dangerous, probably, the fact that nobody knows where they came from.
Nobody knows where they came from, and certainly they. In fact, the best clue that I got was from Abe Foxman. There's a great documentary about him, particularly about Herzl, called Herzl and Anti-Semitism, because it talks about Herzl's recommendation to use anti-Semitism to advance
right.
the Zionist
I
agenda.
remember that. Yeah.
So Abe Foxman explained to the interviewer, he said, like, if I can paraphrase what he said, he says, how do you fight the conspiracy without using it? Right? So the idea is that you have to maintain this myth of a Jewish conspiracy because it keeps people somehow fearing that the Jews have this formidable power. And maybe they don't. But it's the illusion of that power which is so effective. And that's what Abe Foxman himself admitted to.
Yeah, he's made it off handsomely. Those guys at the Anti-Defamation League generate tons of money. Same with the SPLC is immensely wealthy. If you read their stuff, it's based upon magnifying the hate. It's actually, in my opinion, they magnify the hate to their own benefit.
So that's exactly what I discovered, is that the person who is responsible for disseminating protocols in partnership with Henry Ford is a guy named Boris Brasov. And he is a crypto Jew as well, white Russian. And he is part of an organization called the Aufbau. And this is a great book by Michael Kellogg. I can't remember the title, but exposes the Russian roots of the Nazis, something like that. That basically shows that the Aufbau was the source of the Nazi Party. In particular, they're the ones who introduced the Nazis to the protocols. And the protocol. So what I also traced, now we won't be able to cover all this, but I traced extensive interaction of, I believe that Hitler was a British agent. I believe that Aleister Crowley was his handler. And I cover all those connections in a chapter called the Cliveden Set. But basically what happens is that Boris Brasov then comes to the United States. And then he becomes, quote unquote, the brain trust of the America First Committee. America First is actually a slogan of the Klan. We have to remember that the Klan, again, goes back to Albert Pike. And there's a whole history there that we could cover in another show. Time. But the history of the American Civil War, which I cover in some detail, that shows
there's an occult history there. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. So so basically, Boris Brasov founds. I'll summarize this. Try to summarize pretty quickly. Basically, he founds the America First Committee, which is composed of all the leading fascist organizations of the time, principally the Klan, the German Bund, the Silver Shirts, and a number of other leading American fascists. That evolves into the America First Committee, which becomes the core, it's been referred to as the heart of the military-industrial complex. And of course, basically, they are affiliated with an organization called American Jews Against Communism, and they are the ones that appoint Roy Cohn. They basically introduce Roy Cohn to McCarthy, who becomes his right-hand man. And they begin this communist scare because the communist scare is essential for building up the military-industrial complex. And one of their tools is using the fear of this Jewish conspiracy by spreading the protocols. So they're all affiliated with the Knights of Malta. The American Knights of Malta are called the Chicksini Knights of Malta. And this is really the core organization which is behind American, right? They're behind. So they lead through the American Jewish communism. They evolved into William F. Buckley's National Review, which was also composed of members of the John Birch Society. And this is where you get the core.
Right?
This is the core network involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which apparently is perpetrated by the Permindex, to which Roy Cohn was a member. And then out of this, you get the secret team. And the secret team is a core group around Ted Shackley, working for the CIA. This is where they begin their drug trade in the Golden Triangle, which begins the history that evolves into the Iran-Contra mission. Out of Iran-Contra, that group around...
Side story that'll be fascinating. When I was in D.C., I actually... she brought me the daughter of Ted Shackley.
Wow.
Brought me a couple beers. Yeah, so I said she was definitely from the elite set, very put together, very preppy, and very sophisticated, much more so than me at the time.
It's another level.
I had a friend who now works for George Soros, and he's like, "Do you know who her dad is?" And I said, "I have no idea." Her dad is the blonde ghost. I said, "Okay." And then I went home and kind of did some research. I went, "Oh,
Googled it."
So
yeah, exactly.
But yeah, no, Shackley was something else.
So that leads all the way up to Iran-Contra. Out of Iran-Contra, you get the CNP, Council for National Policy, and from there you get Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that all of this group is basically it's the right wing. It's the Fascist International, and the parent organization is called Le Cercle, the Circle. That's founded by Antoine Pinet and Jean Violet. Antoine Pinet was a friend of a guy named Raymond Abellio, who is one of the contributors to the Priory of Zion mythos, which again is based on the prophecies of Nostradamus and Secrets of Fatima. His protege is a guy named Jean Parvulescu, and Jean Parvulescu's protege is a guy named Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin, of course, is known as Rasputin, who is the guy who was responsible for the Mossad operation to disguise itself as a Russian operation to assist Donald Trump's election.
Fascinating. That's incredible. Dugin also has like a Crowley connection too. Have you ever seen him reciting one of Crowley's poems?
Oh yeah, he's a Crowleyite through and through.
Oh, is he really? Does he just define himself as a Thelemite? Do you know? Not
really a Thelemite. He would be referred to as a traditionalist, and traditionalist basically is what synarchism is today. So there's four people that are important to the history of synarchism. So it starts with Saint Jesus d'Albedre, then René Guénon, and then Julius Evola, who's the ideologue of the Gladio operations, and then in our time, Alexander Dugin.
And you did some writing on it too. Did you cover Order of Nine Angles in this book?
Yes, I do. I believe it's in the chapter on the Black Order, because they are all connected directly and indirectly to Dugin.
Really? Okay, so Dugin has a connection to Mayan. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's so much more to cover. I mean, I hate to wrap this up. I'd love to have you back and do another show on some of the specifics of this, because there's so much information here, guys. It's encyclopedic, but the ties, you can just see the history, the kind of esoteric or underground, the history of all these people connected to each other. And I'd like to hear your story about how Crowley, but there's a lot of connections between Crowley and Hitler, much more than people know. Barbagallo, a lot, which you probably know. But I mean,
Crowley was a friend of Baron Ludendorff, the famous World War I general, who was also he was also both a member of the Aufbau and a member of the Thule Society.
Right.
The one, what's interesting is also von Papen was in the United States working with Crowley and another guy named George Sylvester Viereck in black propaganda.
Right. Okay. So I didn't know that he was Viereck, but it's interesting. Crowley knew Viereck very well, and would correspond with him. Who was one of the first people who interviewed Hitler, where Hitler laid out all of his program in 1923? It was Viereck.
That's right. Viereck is an amazing character. He's friends with Tesla, friends with Einstein, friends with Freud. He's also ends up in the United States friends with who is the guy, the Kinsey, Alfred Kinsey, who's a friend of Kenneth Anger. They all hang out Viereck's apartment in New York, and guess who else is there? People like friends, guys from the National Renaissance Party that Eustace Mullins belonged to.
That who belonged to Eustace Mills? Oh my gosh, so great, incredible. When you look at these guys, it's off the charts. And then, so Crowley's one of his buddies who he corresponded with, which I've held like their correspondence in my hand, was Austin Speer, who you mentioned in the book. But that Hitler asked Speer to come to Germany and do his portrait, and so there's a lot of connections. And Crowley kind of infamously stated after Hitler was, I am.
Before Hitler was, I was, exactly.
He actually is it's a direct line from the New Testament, right? So
yeah, Hitler was apparently in school with Wittgenstein.
Wittgenstein, yeah, I've heard that too. He's around. I mean, Hitler was probably in the same universe as a lot of those people who started the Russian Revolution before World War I, probably rubbed noses with Freud and Lenin and Trotsky and all those people.
Yeah, they were all hanging around in Vienna at the same time.
They supposedly all went to the same coffee shop.
That's right.
So anyway,
David
Livingstone, what a fascinating book, man. What a great interview. I definitely recommend people go to ordoabchao.ca and really just try to dig in. There's just so much information there, and just a superb job. I really commend you on this book.
Thank you
for this work. I'd love to have you back. I got to run. I got another interview in about 10 minutes, but I'd like to talk to you sometime in 2021 if we make it past December 21st, right?
January 1st. Yeah. No, thanks for having me on. It was a great interview.
All right. Thanks, David. Take care.